Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Karima Brown and you're watching Political Exchange, where we unpack Africa's political economy. Now, the banking sector is a significant player and a catalyst for economic growth, global competitiveness and socio-economic development and transformation, more so in the context of South Africa's government's infrastructure rollout plan. But the sector is also facing pressures to transform and to provide greater access to banking products for those who have been previously excluded. Joining us now to discuss these issues is Cas Guvadia. He's the Managing Director of the Banking Association of South Africa. Mr. Guvadia, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
You have made several public calls for yourselves as commercial banks to sit down with government, particularly around how to partner, the big infrastructure rollout plan. Take us through some of the thinking within your organization as to how you can come to the party on infrastructure.
Well, Karima, I think what the call we made at our banking summit is that we need to move away from the rhetoric. I think there are a whole range of policy and other issues to be dealt with, which we can interact with government on. But government has identified priority infrastructure projects. We believe that between state-owned institutions like the DBSA, ourselves, Department of Public Enterprises, as well as some of the longer-term funders that are represented by people like the Association of Savings and Investment, to actually sit down around, let's say, 3 or 4 of the most critical projects, put some technical teams around them, and together see how we can work out the optimal financing of those projects. So let's get that done. Let's get that done in a way that risk is allocated appropriately. We're certainly not taking the view that government must take the bulk of the risk. But we are also not taking the view that private sector is here just for a non-profit base. The private sector needs to make an appropriate return. Government needs to meet its socio-economic objectives through it. I think state-owned institutions need to bring funds to the party to actually create some soft fund in the package. And let's then work out the financing arrangements so that together we can then go to government and say, okay, for these 4 projects, the financing is sorted out. This is how we suggest we do the financing. Now it's up to government to implement.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we have seen the upgrading in Gauteng around the tolls and the subsequent, public outcry around that. And there's a big question around whether, SANRAL is able to repay its debts. That's one of the glaring examples of how, people didn't find each other. How do we prevent a situation that is obtaining now, where people had to take court action to compel, users to pay, from happening again? And how does what happened here in Gauteng impact sentiment from commercial institutions such as yourself?
Yeah, I think what needs to pertain is that government needs to conduct the consultations it needs to conduct. And I think it should do that transparently and it should do that thoroughly. And that should be worked into the process. But I think once the consultations are complete, there's no way that government is going to be able to satisfy every party it needs to consult with. I think once the consultations are complete, government needs to make a call and say that from a broader national interest point of view, these are the projects that we want to now actually promote and implement. We've taken into view the views of everybody, and we have accommodated where we can, but for the following reasons, for national interest issues, the project needs to unfold in that way. Mm-hmm. Once that is done, we then put the people around the table and say, let's get this thing done. We don't want to, I don't think it's our place to get involved in the political debate around it, but I think we need to look at these things from a national interest point of view. The problem is that if decisions are taken and then they are changed and then they are taken again and then they are changed, the uncertainty just creates an environment where it's very difficult to actually sit down and work through the finances. Mm-hmm. And so certainly my plea would be that essentially the electorate generally has given this government an overwhelming majority to govern, and I think government must govern, not run roughshod over people. go through the proper consultation processes, but at the end of the day, I think it is up to government to make a decisive call on these issues and stick to decisions when they are made.
Now, one of the announcements that government did make was, of course, the allocations around the Jobs Fund, and you've been saying that you'd like to get involved there. What is the association's view on how they can come to the party on the Jobs Fund?
Well, this Sum Shabalala, our current chair at last year's summit, actually made the call to say government allocates a certain pot of money for the Jobs Fund. We believe that if there is an appetite within government to interact with the broader financial sector, we believe the financial sector has the skills to structure those funds in a way that they leverage as much as possible from the private sector. So instead of 9 billion rand over 5 years or whatever the case may be, you could actually leverage that from the private sector, if it's properly structured, into 90 billion bucks. And so all we're saying is that let's begin talking to each other on these issues so that we optimize the resources we have in the country, instead of just saying, okay, this is what government is putting on the table and that's all we will use. Government to recognize that there are skills and an appetite in the private sector to come to the party on a profit basis, and that if we actually talk together on that basis, we increase the pot of funds available, and we can actually go broader and deeper into the serious challenges that we need to address.
Now, I understand that you have just been in Dar es Salaam looking at interesting ways around funding around housing. Now, of course, we do know that South Africa has located its own economic growth path within the SADC and African, context. What are the opportunities in terms of partnerships, particularly around financing within the broader continent itself?
Well, I think what we were looking at is what are the housing challenges in various countries on the continent. Now, I think we've got to take our hats off to our government in that since '94, we put together a relatively good regulatory environment to promote particularly low-income housing. We built 3 million houses, which is more than most countries in the world in this time. But we do have our problems, and we're constantly reviewing those things. I think the problem in many African countries is that there isn't even a conducive policy environment for this. And what we were looking at is different types of financing. So not just mortgage finance, which is very, very shallow in African countries, but looking at microfinance for housing, looking at different tenure options, looking at how government agencies and the private sector can work together. We were shown housing developments in Dar es Salaam with different types of materials, and we need to move away from purely the bricks and mortar materials, because using different types of materials reduces the cost of building and increases affordability. We were looking at what sort of government incentives could be brought to play. So I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned from other countries in Africa as well as from here. And this was under the auspices of something called the African Union for Housing Finance. And I think what we're looking at is to see if we can advocate for a more appropriate policy environment in different parts of the continent.
Well, in a way, you've just led me to the next set of questions. You have, in your initial answer, said we must move beyond the rhetoric. Now, we know that the African National Congress, which is the governing party in South Africa, has recently held a policy conference and come up with a series of pronouncements on the financial sector. And I'd like to get your take on some of it. Let's start off with the you were saying that we need to move beyond this idea of rhetoric. We need to have clear mixed economy policy objectives and outlines. Why do you think there is the opaque, vague messaging coming from the governing party? Is it that they're trying to accommodate all interests? And isn't that what they have to do, given the fact that the ANC is such a broad church?
Well, I think that is one reason, but the ANC is a broad church, but I think to a certain extent we need to separate state from party. As I said earlier, that the government does have a mandate to govern, and government should be looking at this from a national interest point of view. But I think the other issue is that despite the fact that we have untold number of structures through which government and business and other stakeholders talk to each other, I still think there's a trust deficit.
It's interesting that you say that. I spoke with Ino Godongwana recently on the very same issue. We were debating why, if the social compact that was struck after 94 is still holding, and he was saying that there is a high degree of mistrust, and the ANC's critique of the banking sector in South Africa is often prefaced with this idea that our economy is over-financialized. What is your take on this mistrust? Is it because there is an ideological kind of entrenchment in terms of views from both parties? What is at the root of the mistrust?
Well, I'm not too sure it's an ideological difference. I mean, the ANC's policy is a mixed market economy. The ANC's policy is not socialism. The ANC's policy is not nationalization. There might be certain sectors of communities that promote that, but the ANC policy is quite clear. I think that the problem is that government needs to recognize that the financial sector, through the way it does its profitable business, can actually play a significant role in transformation. It's not just CSI type of activities. And government and the financial sector needs to have this discussion within the context of saying, let's be proud of the fact that we are the second most stable banking sector in the world. Let's be proud of the fact that we are second out of 144 countries, even in financial inclusion. We are second, okay? Let's protect that, but let's at the same time talk about where the gaps exist and how we work together to address those gaps. Why do we need to work together? Because we need to protect this industry, we need to enable it to be profitable, and where the market is not working, I think government needs to intervene and work with the sector to make those markets work, and then pull out. Because government resources, expertise can be used in those areas where markets are never going to work. Don't put government resources into areas where the private sector can actually come in and make things work. They might need help for a period of time, but that help should be with a view to making those markets work. That's what a mixed economy is about.
Now, of course, one of the suggestions that came out of the policy conference is this idea of transforming your old post bank into a state bank. And you were on record as saying that it's a policy suggestion that is doomed to fail, that, you know, it can very well go ahead, but it's going to basically throw money down a black hole.
Well, what we are saying is that if the intention is to set up the post bank to compete with the commercial banking sector, I think it's a problem. Because the commercial banking sector has been around for a long time. It's a complex sector. It has significant infrastructure. It has significant outreach. The post bank has its own strengths. It has a broader geographic outreach than all the commercial banks. It has more affinity, I guess, toward the emerging market. And all we suggested at our financial inclusion in Durban is that, again, Postbank has a particular set of resources. We have a particular set of resources. Let's put those resources together for national interest benefit. And what we're saying is that we could support the Postbank with the IT infrastructure we have. Postbank could work with us to enable us to use their geographic outlets to actually deliver financial services, not just the private bank's financial services, but also the Postbank's financial services. But we put those together and get financial services to where they need to get to. Mr.
Guvadia, we have to take a short break, but when we come back, we will continue our discussion around the banking sector in South Africa with Cass Guvadia, who's the MD of the Banking Association of South Africa.